O'clock. So I will call the October 26th meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission to order. Lisa Patterson, our chair, is out because she's taking care of her mom who's had some health challenges. So my name's Debbie Moore and I'm the vice chair, and I will be chairing the meeting tonight. So it's not my usual role, so be gentle with me. Didi, would you please call the roll?
Yes, ma'am. Debbie Moore.
Here.
Patrick Connell.
Here.
Alyssa Halley-Schramm.
Here.
Diana Rose.
Here.
Cynthia Meyer.
Here.
Sue Ann Fruget.
Here.
Richard Gartman.
Here.
Matt Lassen.
Here.
We have a full house. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And to remind our commission members and for those of you in the audience, Planning and Zoning Commission meetings are now being televised. So if somebody couldn't come tonight and they want to see it later, they'll be able to do that. And commission members, it's important that we use our microphones so that the folks at home can hear us. But after you speak, please turn off your mic, because there's only so many that can be on. If there's too many, we might think that we're being heard over the television, but we're not. So speak and then turn it off, and I'll try to remember to do the same thing. The first item on the agenda is citizen comments. Comments will be heard from the audience on any topic not listed on the agenda, not to exceed 3 minutes in length. To address the commission, please submit a fully completed request card. A little guy like that, Viviana has them, and give it to her prior to the beginning of the meeting. If we're not really strict on that one. But in accordance with the Texas Open Meeting Act, if a citizen discusses any item not on the agenda, the commission cannot discuss issues raised or make any decision at that time. Issues may be referred to the city staff for research and possible future action. So we're not being rude, we just can't comment on any citizen comments that aren't posted. Viviana, do we have any citizen comments? Right, but there's none. But these are on agenda items that I have. All right. So we will now adjourn into a workshop session. We're going to have a presentation from staff on our drainage and what's coming up on that. So, at the request of the commission members, Wesley has come to us with the update on what's happening there. So,
yes, ma'am.
It's all yours.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm excited to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about our favorite subject in the city right now, which is the way our drainage system is functioning and what we're doing to help it function better, as well as what we need to look at in the future to make sure that we utilize that infrastructure and add to that infrastructure in a cost-effective and appropriate way. So I just first was going to talk about the two major issues that we deal with when we talk about drainage systems. It's mainly we're looking at, one, where is that development in relation to the overall watersheds within the city, and how do those impact those watersheds as well as the areas outside of the city. We also need to help make sure that developments are designed in a way that control runoff in a way that does not cause a negative impact to adjoining property owners or other areas downstream of that development, and ensure that everyone kind of is able to develop their property the way they want to, and the city benefits as a whole. So just on top of that, I thought we could go over kind of where our major watersheds are, where all this water comes from. We're a little unique with where the city is situated compared to some of the regional drainage areas that serve not only our city but the areas downstream of it. And we'll also talk about how our system is set up from a management standpoint, how it controls and how it handles water that's trying to flow through the system, depending on how much water and how fast it's trying to flow through. So one of our major watersheds, this slide shows two of our major watersheds that drain pretty much the entire eastern half of the city. Everything east of the Colorado River, for the most part, drains through the Piney Creek watershed, which is a fairly large watershed. It's over 38 square miles with and comparing that to the Gills Branch watershed at a little less than 3 square miles. And so Piney Creek has a huge watershed that encompasses a large area all the way up to Highway 290. So it's well outside of the city boundaries and the county boundaries as well. And so past that, we have our Colorado River watershed, which is over 39,000 square miles. The importance of this, and I apologize, there we go. So the importance of this is the Colorado River watershed operates slightly different than the other two because it's so large. The flooding impacts that we've seen in the past have been caused because of water that's come from way north of us. You know, the water that falls, or the rainfall that develops here, is normally out of the system by the time that water gets here and causes the impacts that we've seen over the years. I want to also add on this, the one great impact that this watershed has is you can also see the backwater effects, where that water is actually coming up another waterway and affecting the flood carrying capacity of that creek, just because of the water that's inside the river. Another major watershed is on the west side of the river, and it drains, we call it our Shiloh Road watershed because it's a roughly 3.3 square mile area, so it's roughly the size of the Gills Branch watershed, but it all drains the Hunters Crossing subdivision, it drains Burleson Crossing, and it all sort of travels south and crosses Shiloh Road, which then goes under Highway 304 and then enters the Colorado River. So this is a graph that we've started keeping track of to compare the different storms that we've had over the years and comparing how they impact our system relative to each other. So the latest one we've added is this red line, and that's the line from Hurricane Harvey. And the way this graph is set up is it's trying to show how that rainfall accumulates over the life of that storm event. And so in the case of Hurricane Harvey, we had about 19.1 inches of rain that fell over roughly 50 hours. So we're talking over a 2-day period, we got 19.1 inches of rain. And all of us were here when that happened, and we all kind of know the impacts that we saw because of that. We really did not have a lot of significant damage around the city. Our system was able to carry that water because that water fell over such a long period of time. And when you compare that to another storm such as the Memorial Day flood of last year, which is the dark black line, I apologize, my pointer's not pointing at the TV, but we had about 8.3 inches, which is less than half of the rain that we got over Hurricane Harvey, but since it fell over a 9-hour time period, most of us were here, we know what kind of impacts we saw from that. So that just kind of shows you how the timing of that rainfall is really the critical factor in how our system handles that water that's trying to flow through the system.
How many inches per hour is the system designed to handle? Supposed to, ideally.
Normally, when we start to see or get concerned about having damage, it's usually when we're getting between close to 3 inches per hour for more than a few hours.
Okay.
And so below that, that's usually the intensity that can sort of flow through the system without backing up too much and causing a lot of significant impacts.
Okay, thank you.
And so the May 2016 event, most of us were here. It affected a lot of property within the city, and really, gave us a good learning experience about what needs to happen with our system and what we need to do to improve it, what we can expect out of the system, and what kind of options we have for making the conditions better so that we can better handle these larger storm events. There's always going to be events that we can't handle. But we do want to improve the system so that it operates as efficiently as possible and can carry as much water as effectively as possible. And so when we get into these river areas and the areas outside of those waterways, we have what are called special flood hazard areas. And most of us have seen maps that show a 100-year floodplain line. A lot of us are familiar with that. And that area shown on that map is a representation of where floodwaters could reach if the storm conditions that created the flood stages within the river or whatever waterway you're looking at, it would show where that water could get under those conditions. And so those are certainly areas that you want to pay very close attention to when it comes to managing those areas and controlling development within those areas, because they can potentially have an impact on that property and properties up and downstream of it. So here's a sample of what a floodplain map would look like. You can see that there's areas that are shaded darker than others. And these maps contain a lot of information about how that waterway operates under flood conditions. And that areas that are the lightest gray are considered what we call a 500-year floodplain area, which is typically an unrestricted development, but it's in terms of regulations, but it's also an area that could see flooding under certain conditions. And then the areas that are darker gray are the areas that would want to be managed in a way that were brought out of that flood zone or built in a way that could withstand the flood conditions.
How often is this map updated? I noticed it says 2006.
So that is a great question. The map says that it's current as of 2006, and they are updated. It's not there's not a standard update period that FEMA uses. Some maps are updated more often than others. This map is dated 2006. However, just because the map is updated does not necessarily mean that the underlying data that is producing the maps is necessarily updated. They may update a certain area, they may update the map to include, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but there's ways to amend the maps based on what kind of developments occurred. And so sometimes the maps are updated simply to reflect those updates. But this, in particular, our maps, most of our maps have data that dates back to the 1980s. And so that's why, we'll talk about this as well, that's why we're going through a lot of effort to have some studies done that will get us better information that are not only taking into account the development and the conditions that have been changed since these maps were developed, but also using more modern techniques that are much more accurate at representing what those flood conditions will look like.
Is that something that the city would work with FEMA on to update those, or is that a private individual, or a new development, or somebody wants to change their flood elevation so they don't have to pay flood insurance, or can the city go to FEMA and try to get them to update their maps for the area?
Yes, it's a little bit of all of that, just depending on what's happened. For instance, the study that we're having done to establish more detailed information along Piney Creek and Gills Branch is all being done under the standards that FEMA has that would then be incorporated into a future map update. And so the key to all that is you want to collect the information and present the information in a way that's consistent with how FEMA develops their maps so that all can be brought in and more easily updated into those FEMA maps.
So the plan would be for once the city acquires the data and we're done with that period to move with FEMA to try and get those maps updated.
That's right. We will give that information to FEMA and it will be available to them. We can't control when they update the maps,
right.
But it is very useful information to the city that we can use going forward.
And the city can use their own data to establish guidelines. We don't have to use FEMA's maps, correct?
Yes, we can use that as the best available information and use that as part of any floodplain development regulations that we have. And so we have, kind of gone into the modern age where we've been able to include a lot of the map information into a digital GIS database, which makes it much easier to work with and work with when it comes to development applications and trying to calculate and assess what kind of conditions we need to work with.
For folks that may not understand or know what the government alphabet is, would you tell people what a D-firm and a GIS mapping system are?
Sorry about that. Yes, so the acronym FIRM stands for Flood Insurance Rate Map, and it is simply a map that is produced in order to assign the risk that certain properties have to undergo certain flooding conditions. And it's not a map that shows what will happen. It shows, based on the information that's been collected, it's the best analysis of what could happen and what kind of impacts you could see under certain conditions. And the D in front of DFIRM just stands for digital. So it's GIS stands for Geographic Information System, and it's a combination of hardware and software that we use to what we call spatially reference everything so that we can analyze information that's all related to each other geographically. And so that becomes very useful when you're looking at anything from addressing to drainage modeling or any kind of utility infrastructure. It allows you to look at the relationship that all of that infrastructure has with each other. So it's incredibly useful information that we have and that we use. And so here's just a list of some of the requirements that we have based on the different areas that are defined on those flood maps. An area called a floodway is, it would mainly be what you would think of as the main creek bed. It's the area that you really do not want to develop in or do any kind of work in, because that is the main path that water takes when it's trying to flow through that waterway. And then there's areas outside of those floodways that, depending on how close they are to the floodways and how much information is available, that defines the elevations or the level that water could get to. There's other regulations that apply to those. There's different zones, which are those special flood hazard areas that have different requirements. And there's also processes that developers must go through if they want to change that. There are areas that are suitable for development as long as they're built to a certain standard and that certain measures are taken to ensure that they're not susceptible to flooding. And so there's, we've got some other acronyms here, but there's an acronym called a CLOMR, which stands for a conditional letter of map revision and a letter of map revision. And it's simply a process that you can go through to adjust the maps depending on what kind of proposal you have. And so when we get into how we control the amount of water that gets into the system in the first place, there's a lot of requirements that we have that define how a system or a subdivision or any kind of commercial site must be designed. And all of that's done in a way to make sure that those developments are able to carry the water away from not only their development, but carry it away in a way that does not impact downstream properties or upstream properties. And so some of the major factors that go into that are the amount of impervious cover that's placed on the property. It's, in fact, I've got a little diagram here. When you think of development, and typically you are turning vacant land into developed property. And so you're taking area that's today might be grass and trees, and you're converting that into a paved surface or an area that has buildings with rooftops. Well, those areas don't absorb rainwater very well, and so instead they shed that water off, and it creates runoff not only at a faster rate, but also at a greater intensity. So
I think Houston is a great example of what happens.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. When you, yes, they definitely have some issues that they're dealing with right now. And so that's kind of the approach that we take when we're looking at runoff from particular developments. We want to make sure that the capacity of the system is such that it can handle different levels of rainwater and storm events, and then also that we make sure that it does not cause an adverse impact to neighboring properties. One thing that our requirements don't really speak to is water quality. Many cities have requirements that not only require you to mitigate the quantity impacts of that water, and we're talking about peak flow rates and the volume of water that's leaving the site, but many cities actually require that it be cleaner, so that you install measures that actually allow that water to kind of allow sediment to filter out, or allow any other contaminants that you would see from a developed property versus an undeveloped property. You know, we've all been in a shopping center parking lot and seen what builds up in those parking lots, and you know, today that water those contaminants just wash directly into the system, into the river. And so many cities have requirements that actually require developers to contain that and control that, and actually do something to improve the quality of the water before it leaves the site.
And why don't we have that?
Well, we're going to get into that on the next agenda item, but that is a great question.
I got you.
So when we talk about that peak flow and the drainage that leaves a property after it's developed, what our requirements say is that you have to develop the property in a way that does not adversely affect adjoining property owners. And generally speaking, the way that's done is to mitigate the peak flows and restrict those peak flows that are leaving the site after it's developed, so that it does not exit the property or discharge from the property at a rate greater than it did before it was developed. And so that's a very common, it's very common to see detention ponds around the city, and that's their purpose, is to provide a place for that water, that additional runoff, to build up and discharge at a rate that's less than what it was, that's similar to what it was before it was developed. So our infrastructure is designed to handle different design storms depending on where it is. There's infrastructure that's designed to handle a larger storm, such as a 100-year storm, which, you know, when we say 100-year storm, it's very common to think that that means that it happens once in 100 years, and I think we all know that that hasn't been the case here. And when we talk about what we think of as a 100-year storm, that's nothing more than the statistical chance or the probability that we would get that level of storm event within a 1-year period. And so it's technically called the 1% annual chance, which is easier to say a 100-year storm, but it does not mean that it's only going to happen once in 100 years. It just means that there's a 1% chance that it could happen in any given year. So there's nothing saying that it can't happen every year. It's just there's a statistic that goes along, and that's how it's classified. But when we do get that storm, we have infrastructure that's designed to handle the flows from those storms, and they are your larger infrastructure like your box culverts that go under some of the major streets that we have in town. When you drive along 71 and you see big box culverts going under the road, that's typically designed to handle a larger storm event such as a 100-year storm. And then we have infrastructure that's designed to handle a smaller storm such as a 25-year storm, and that infrastructure is smaller, and it must be designed to also have a way for that water that's overwhelming the system in case we do get a storm that's greater than a 25-year storm. We try to design that to where even though that infrastructure is overwhelmed, that water still has another place to go without damaging property around it. So, Patrick, you had asked this before, why don't we have those requirements? And the question, or the answer is we probably should. And we're going to talk, the next agenda item is going to speak to that, about the updates we're wanting to make to our subdivision regulations that would include requirements for that. And one of the major topics that goes along with those water quality requirements are what we call sustainable development. And in a nutshell, all it is designing development so that they mimic nature and that pre-developed condition as much as possible. The benefit to that is you, one, significantly reduce the need for just a detention pond, which in most cases is, one, taking up extra land that could otherwise be used for something else, and it becomes a maintenance issue. We have problems around town with detention ponds not being maintained properly, and so taking a more sustainable approach helps developments not create the runoff in the first place. And so you end up with a development that frankly looks much better because you typically have more open space, you tend to have less parking, less impervious cover, and so you're doing more to mimic that natural condition than what our requirements otherwise allow. Almost every time it's the developer. It's either the developer or the property owner. And so on commercial projects, it's either the property owner. Many times they have a property owners association. Burleson Crossing would be a good example. They have one large detention pond that serves the entire development. So they have restrictions and a property owners association that all collectively maintains that area.
Is there a mechanism for the city to enforce that? Fines or something else, where if we don't have somebody who's required to maintain their detention pond and we find that they're not, is there a way to force them to do that?
There is. We do have ordinances that do require that. The problem we have with those ordinances is they're not strong enough, and so we do run into issues where enforcing it can be a challenge because of the routes we have to take to enforce those are can be a little tricky. And so that's another important piece to that, is making sure that either the agreements or any other requirements that we need to ensure that those areas are properly maintained, that those measures are in place.
So do we need ordinances with better teeth or better agreements with the developers when they come looking to develop?
It's usually a little bit of both, because if you have the agreements and if the developer complies with those agreements, it puts less pressure on having ordinances with a greater level of enforcement ability.
Right.
Wesley, what percentage do you guess at that are not maintained right now in the ponds?
Well, some of them are maintained. They may not be maintained well enough, and so they may function well, but there is a difference between functioning well and looking good. We have a lot of detention areas that may function the way they're designed to, but they may not look that great. And so that's another issue that we deal with. But I'd say it's probably 30–40% of them, less than half, because we really don't have that many, because honestly the requirements for detention really did not go into effect until around 2007. And so only developments that have occurred, since around 2007, some of them earlier, but for the most part, our requirement for that has been since 2007, so it hasn't been around that long.
Wesley, on the maintenance area, is this some of the issues that was being addressed with Hunter's Crossing? The retention and drainage systems weren't maintained?
Yes, that was part of it. We were dealing with, some areas that were either not maintained as well as they could have been, or they were clogged by construction debris, and we didn't realize it. There was, when we went through that project, we found a lot of debris in the system that once we cleaned it out, it really made a huge difference. And so that kind of goes back to the maintenance requirements and making sure that sites are developed in a way that keeps that from happening.
I'm curious about what the current enforcements look like versus what they might possibly be in the future.
So today, the way we enforce it is we have an ordinance that falls more under our nuisance category, and it requires that developers and property owners maintain their drainage system appropriately. And so the problem with it is it's a little vague, and so when you want to enforce that, you're really going through more of a code enforcement process, which can be a little lengthy, and it's a little tougher to get compliance sometimes. And so another way to require that is to have the agreements that Patrick mentioned, and also have a more descriptive process for what has to be maintained and how it has to be maintained. That's probably our biggest issue with that ordinance, is it just says it has to be maintained. It doesn't really detail what maintain means and what those maintenance standards look like. And so that's what we would want to focus on.
I guess my question really is, or else, if you don't maintain them, what happens?
So that's another side of it. We try to not have to go there, but depending on the circumstances and the risk to downstream properties, because that's another very important piece to it that we look at. There's different steps depending on how complicated it is or how egregious it is. But we would either go through the code enforcement process, or there's ways to make sure, if it's a commercial area, there's ways to affect the property owner's business to make sure that it gets done in a timely manner. And so there's different options that we have. Like I said, we don't like to go there, but sometimes it does happen. Does that answer your question? So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but it's this is some other examples of how water quality requirements can really help not only improve the functionality of a system and the pressure that our system has to function properly and be sized accordingly, but it also looks really good. So it can cover a lot of bases if they're designed properly. And so some of the other considerations that we might look at or might want to consider is the setbacks and the amount of effort that we go into when we're in the planning phase. One of the major or one of the great things about low impact development is in almost every case you can lower the cost of that development because you're reducing the amount of infrastructure that you can install. And if you get really creative with the way the development is laid out, you can sometimes get the same level of yield, whether it be the number of lots or the amount of available square footage in a commercial building. You can many times get this same level of benefit on that side of things, even though you're putting more of these considerations in place. So here's just some other examples of subdivisions that are designed to kind of maximize the open space and limit how much runoff leaves the property. So that's really all I had. I wanted to talk about kind of how the system works and what we're doing to try to improve the system, not only from a capacity standpoint, but from also the standpoint of trying to limit how much runoff gets to the system in the first place.
How are we doing on maintenance of the current system?
We're doing very well. So in fact, let me go back to this slide where we...
No more trees in the drainage system?
I can't say that there's no trees there, but we are actively pursuing. There's some areas that...
At least not big trees, huh?
That's right. There's some areas that we, for legal reasons, cannot do as much work as we'd like to. There's areas that are protected by the federal government. They're either in an endangered species area, and they limit how much work we can do inside the area, even if we wanted to. But,
Thank you.
Our Public Works Department has just done a great job of creating a maintenance program where we're spending as much time as possible cleaning out areas and working in areas that have experienced localized drainage problems to try to make that water and help that water get into the system a little more efficiently. We've seen that in many areas where the water it's not that it doesn't get into the system, it just takes forever to get there. And so sometimes it makes sense to try to help that water get there a little more efficiently.
How much impact, I don't know if you can answer this, but how much impact will our new overpasses have on the way water flows, the way it drains, and stormwater, being able to divert it the way we need for it to go so it doesn't flood folks?
That is a great question, Debbie, and it's something that, one thing with drainage systems is they can be rather complicated, and what you would think happens is not always what happens. And in the case of Highway 71, the work that they're doing, even though they are expanding and adding new pavement, new frontage roads, they're putting in an overpass, so the impervious area is increasing. The system improvements that they're making are being done so that that capacity is increased in the system, so that it's in almost every case, actually no, in every case, it's actually lowering the flood elevation that we would expect to see under the same conditions than what it was before. Because they're making capacity improvements that help get that water into an area that can better handle those peak flows compared to what happens now, which is they tend to back up because the system becomes overwhelmed. And so that's why there's sometimes you look at that and it can be very counterintuitive.
Any other questions from the Commission?
Yeah, I've got one question. Wesley, you were talking about sustainable development and the retention ponds and then the water quality ones. Is that possible that those systems could be designed to do double duty, so when they're dry they could be parks and when they're wet they're swamps? That's
one of the best things about low impact development is you can use them for not only for all kinds of amenities. There's areas that Hunter's Crossing is a great example. It has an area that holds water constantly, but that pond system is designed to also not only control peak flow. Once we get these larger storms, it actually has detention capacity on top of the capacity that it needs to hold water all the time. But then there's also areas that have, I think there's a soccer field that fills up with water when we get a big storm, but on the other, in our case, the other 364 days a year that we don't have storms, we always seem to get a storm on Memorial Day and on Halloween. So the other 364 days a year, you've got a soccer field to play in. So.
Thank you. We'll move on now to item 3B, presentation on subdivision ordinance update. That was Jennifer.
Good evening. This is one of the projects that our interim director, David Gaddis, has been working on, and he unfortunately had a previous engagement that he'd already booked, so I'm giving the presentation tonight. So I hope I do it justice. So what we're talking about tonight is our subdivision ordinance update. Just kind of in the past few years, the city has, and previous staff have worked hard. You guys have adopted a new form-based code for downtown, and you've updated your comprehensive plan and your transportation plan. So this is kind of the next step, is to look at the subdivision ordinance and to do some pretty good updates. So kind of backtracking is on what are we trying to do with the subdivision ordinance. The primary goal of subdivision regulations is to promote orderly growth of the city. When you can develop in an orderly fashion, it reduces infrastructure maintenance costs. It improves safety, function, and accessibility to those developed areas. And it also establishes the character that we want to see for the city. It also establishes a set of consistent rules and standards that apply to everyone. Just to kind of give you the big, 1,000-foot view of planning process. The very first step before you do anything, if it's not in the city limits, you have to annex into the city. The next step is to establish your zoning district on a piece of property. The step after that is subdivision, which is what we're talking about specifically, is how you divide up land into developable residential and commercial lots. And going into that is also the infrastructure improvements, how those get put in place to serve those lots. And then the final step in the process then is getting building permits to build what you're going to use on that lot. How do we accomplish all of these things? We have first our subdivision ordinance. It establishes our infrastructure requirements for when you're dividing up land. How are you getting your water? How are you getting your sewer? How are you getting streets and drainage dealt with in your neighborhood or commercial development? What do the lots look like in that area in relation to the streets and all of these infrastructure items? And also parkland dedication is one of the big items we look at, especially with residential development. The zoning ordinance is the part of our code that looks at land use and then our site development. So that determines, once you have your lot, what can you do on that lot? How tall can you build? What materials does your structure need to be made out of? That's the kind of things that are in our zoning ordinance. And then lastly, we have our building regulations, which is established by the International Building Code. To kind of give you a working picture of how this is going on a project that you all are pretty familiar with at this point, it's Pecan Park Residential subdivision, and you kind of see all these phases playing out at the time that this aerial was taken. In area, you have the zoning's been established for the entire planned development for Pecan Park, which is the larger red area. Sections 3A and 6A at this point had preliminary plats approved, and they were in the construction plan phase where they're establishing their infrastructure to serve those lots. Section 5B in this picture has gotten all the infrastructure in, is at that point that's getting ready to get their building permits to build those houses on the lots. And then 4 and 5A, you can see, are partially built out. So they've received their building permits to build on those lots that have been established through the subdivision process. Why do we need to update the subdivision ordinance? Most of our ordinance is 17 to 20 years old. It dates back to the late 90s. There were a couple amendments that you can see throughout the code in 2004 and 2008, mostly. By doing piecemeal updates over the years, it's left the ordinance a bit disjointed. There's sections that don't reference each other as well as they should. And we need to make sure all of those sections work together. There's also, it duplicates some of the language in different places that's not helpful when you're reviewing or for developers to understand our standards. And it can be a bit weak in policy standards. Going to what is a plat. It's a legal document that establishes your property boundaries, the public right-of-way, and easements. It's a requirement in the local government code. And one of the things it does is, this is where you really establish your vested rights. What does your lot look like? What are your setbacks? And another thing it establishes is your impact fees. You lock in on your impact fees on the date that your subdivision is platted.
Can you give a couple of sentences on just what an impact fee is and what it's for?
Impact fees are a fee that gets established when the use, a single-family lot, a commercial use, is put on the site to pay for the expansion of the overall system. And this is more what Wesley looks at. So that additional house that gets added onto the system and that additional water that goes to the wastewater plant, that additional demand on the water infrastructure, that impact fee goes to pay for that additional cost to the system. To give some examples, plats can look very different. A lot of people come in and say, I'm only developing one lot, why do I need to plat? So you can have, like Pecan Park, Section 4, where you have, I think, 45 lots, or you can have Buc-ee's, that is just one big lot. But they still had to plat because you still had to establish your street access, your utilities, and all of those things. And again, why are we updating the subdivision ordinance? This is an additional step. As I talked about, this is what establishes the standards. By state law, once a subdivision or a developer has met the standards that are in our code, the city has to approve their plat. It's called a ministerial process. So we really need to make sure what we want out of the subdivision regulations are upfront, to be consistently followed, so that we don't get into any legal binds.
Jennifer, I just want to clarify for people watching at home and whoever's here, just to clarify, if they meet the requirements, the city has zero authority, either at our level here at P&Z or the city council, the city has zero authority to deny that plat or disapprove.
Yes.
That, correct?
And in fact, the state law requires that once a plat is deemed administratively complete, meaning the staff has reviewed it and we don't find any errors in what they're doing, that the city has 30 days to get that approved. So they've actually, the state puts the cities on a timeline so that you can't delay something for 6 months to a year. You have a very strict time frame that you have to adhere to once they've met all of the rules.
And if the city exceeds that 30 days, is it considered an automatic approval, or they can proceed without approval, or how does that?
It ends up playing out in court, is usually how that happens.
Okay.
So
Okay.
that's why we want to make sure we're following the local government code. One of the things we're looking at in this update is the process. Our goal is customer service. We don't want to have any unreasonable delays because of confusion in the code. Some of our timelines in the code, I think just because they're outdated, violate the current local government code. We have in one part that says 45 days when really it's 30. And then, yeah, our process currently is that the plat has to come before planning and zoning and then goes to city council, and that additional step adds 2 weeks to a month to the process sometimes. And also the way we've described some of the processes in the code has created confusion for developers and surveyors. Some of the design issues that Wesley kind of touched on in his drainage discussion is that our language is a little weak and is vague for especially enforcement reasons. It also, as I said, is a dated code. It really is showing kind of an older style of development that promotes suburban development and sprawl, that causes you to have to spread out your lots a lot more and spread out your infrastructure. It also does not specifically help to promote the unique feel of Bastrop in our character as a rural, smaller town. And it also does not help promote the environmentally sustainable, low-impact development that Wesley was talking about. So our strategy for this update, Dave's been rewriting, looking, figuring out our current code, And he's kind of broken it down into 3 sections. The first is to outline the policies, procedures, basically the how-to, like how to turn in your plat, what do you need to turn into us. The second section will look at specific standards such as tree preservation, parkland dedication, street design, and lot and block standards. So how long can your block be before you need another street, those kind of things. Also, and then the third section will look at more of the engineering standards, drainage design, the water, sewer, electrical, street lights, all those infrastructure requirements that we want to make sure are promoting the best long-term infrastructure maintenance costs for the city. The schedule for this for P&Z tonight, we're introducing the topic. At the next meeting in November, I think the goal is to have a working draft to you guys before that. And then at the 1st of January, have the total ordinance presented. And then by the end of January, have P&Z officially review and provide a recommendation to City Council for the new subdivision ordinance. And then Council would take action in the February meetings. Right now, one of the things our Dave is working with is our new city attorney to make sure that we're covering all the legal guidelines. Some of the general changes that we're proposing at this point is trying to order the ordinance in a logical flow. Right now, if you open our subdivision ordinance, it starts with impact fees. So when you're an average person, then we tell you to go to the section, you're starting with this very technical explanation of impact fees, which is not helpful in the code. The second one is looking at the specific policies, standards, and definitions, and then submittal requirements to make sure we're getting everything submitted that staff needs to review. And then the specific approval authority, who is going to look and have the final approval of these plats as allowed by state law. What the goal at this stage is to have council delegate that authority to the Planning and Zoning Commission. So talking a little bit about the process, one of the new steps that we're introducing is called a sketch plat. And what this will do is requires a subdivider to, this won't have to be like an engineer drawing, but it'll be a sketch of what you're trying to do. So staff can take a look at it, review the street layout, the kind of a high level view to make sure you're in the right process. A lot of times we have a surveyor that'll submit something to us as an amending plat and they're creating additional lots, which you can't do through that process. So then we have to reroute them into the correct process. So this step will actually be able to get a submittal review and then sit down with the subdivider or developer and go over exactly what they will need to submit for the official submittal. Some of the things that we'll look at is what specific process. Our standard in-city process, short form process, which is a quicker process to go through when you're doing very, very small infrastructure improvements, our administrative process, and then the residential replat process. It also depends on where you are, whether you're in the city, the ETJ, or our voluntary ETJ on what standards apply. And then the design standards that go into that. Our standard review process is coming through the preliminary and the final plat process, so, which is what you'll see tonight. We'll have a preliminary plat that lays out the initial layout of the subdivision, and then after that we have a construction plan phase that we establish all of the infrastructure improvements that need to be put in, and then the final plat gets approved after that. What we are proposing is that this will be approved by Planning and Zoning and not City Council. Similarly, the short form review process, this enables someone that's doing a very small subdivision with small infrastructure improvements to do just a one-step plat, a final plat, showing some infrastructure improvements. And this would also be approved by Planning and Zoning. And then the administrative review process, which will remain largely as it is now, which is looking at minor plats, amending plats, and some replats, and this is defined by state law that can be reviewed administratively and don't have to go before a board or commission. The residential replat process is a very specific process outlined by the state that requires new residential lots in an established plat to have a public hearing, which we also have that tonight on the agenda. But that will also be approved by planning and zoning. And I will let Wesley talk a little bit about his engineering side of this.
So I'm going to talk about the dorky side of this. So, as Jennifer said, there's a lot of work that goes into subdivisions and platting that looks at not only the layout and the size of lots and how the lots are situated, but we also look at the infrastructure that's going to be put in to accommodate those lots and that property in a way that's sustainable and does not create a long-term maintenance problem for the city. Because the way typical developments work when it comes to what we call public improvements, and those are the main streets and the utilities that serve not just an individual property, but a subdivision or a large development as a whole. You know, for instance, we have a new dentist office across the street. I think you know a little bit about it. And so the improvements that Dr. Lassen would have put in his development are all considered private. They connect to the public system. And when we have a development that installs not only those improvements, but the improvements that are typically in the street that serve the overall development, that's what we review very closely to make sure that after they're built and the city accepts the maintenance of those forever, that they're built in a way that they're ensured to last a very long time. And so as we go through that process, we look at a lot of different things from the overall development drainage and how that system will work as a whole. And then we also drill down into specific lots, because you can significantly impact the way a development drains just by modifying one lot, either in a bad or good way. We've seen subdivisions where just somebody building their house a little low or a little high has a huge impact on the way the rest of the subdivision drains. So that's a very critical aspect of what we look at. We also look at the street layout. Or a couple of pieces to our subdivision ordinance right now talks about cul-de-sacs. Our new standards really want to limit and eliminate as many cul-de-sacs as possible, because they do not promote a well-connected system. A good example of a well-connected system is the downtown area. You have blocks that are not dead-end streets, and it's can be very easy to get around because you have options. And so our new street standards are going to look at not only the layout of those streets and the amount of connectivity they provide through the overall development, but they're also going to look at the standard that they're built to make sure that they can handle the types of vehicles for the amount of time that we need them to handle that. A lot of us know that some of our streets are not in the best shape, and a lot of that is because of the way they were built. And so we want to have standards that ensure those streets are built in a way that will last a long time and require very little maintenance.
Wesley, quick question. On the streets, will the new standards also incorporate more pedestrian-friendly street design layout?
You brought that up. Yes, ma'am. So that's another sort of vague or an area of our subdivision ordinance that's not as robust as it could be. And so that is definitely something that we're wanting to incorporate into those standards, because what we're finding, and we're doing a lot of research on how cities are handling congestion and how they're promoting walkability for many different reasons. The more walkable a community is, the less reliant it is on its transportation system to begin with. It just has a tremendous amount of benefit, and so that is a critical piece to that. A good example, our subdivision ordinance today requires a 4-foot wide sidewalk in residential areas, and it does require sidewalks in commercial areas, but there's not a lot of rules that require it to be a well-connected system. And so there's areas that need to be improved so that there isn't just a sidewalk to nowhere. And so that's another critical component that we're looking at.
I didn't think to include bike infrastructure as well. Does it also include bicycles?
Yes, we want the bikes on there too. And so that goes back to the street standards, making sure that they are built to the dimensions that could support that. And we want to come up with different options because different areas of the city and different places have different concerns that need to be addressed. There's some areas that need to handle more traffic than others, and so we want to kind of differentiate between our extremely low volume streets so that we can maybe we don't need a street that's as wide as a collector street that might be in another subdivision. We want to come up with more options that could not only reduce the cost and the amount of infrastructure that has to be installed, but could also provide more room for more active transportation options.
And I do believe that walkability and bicycling ranked very high.
Number one.
In our comprehensive plan. So.
They are number one. And so it's, we're looking at not only just typical sidewalks and other street level improvements, but we're also looking at the way those subdivisions connect to other developments. And so we're looking at trail systems and ways to incorporate more of that into the design of these areas.
There's going to be sidewalks on both sides of streets?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yay.
In almost every case, yes. Yes. We also look at the other utilities that you don't see but are also important. We all want our faucets to turn on and we all want our toilets to flush. And we're looking at the design criteria that we use to make sure that those utilities are built in a way that can be extended in the future and adequately serve the needs that citizens have, not only from a domestic standpoint, showers and faucets, but also from a fire protection standpoint. So then we also want to look at the standards that we have to actually field locate the boundaries of lots. We have some rules that are fairly dated in that regard, and it's, I don't know if some of you may have owned property, and when you can't find your property corner, it can be very frustrating. And so we want to have standards that help make sure that those property corners are easy to find. Then also, once we get into the development itself, today the way the process typically works is the developer submits the plans, and Jennifer's kind of gone over the types of plans that we see. But once you go through and get that detailed design approved and that final plat approved, and you're ready to actually start building some infrastructure, what typically happens is the developer will hire a contractor, they'll go out and build the infrastructure, the city inspects it, and then at the end of the project, once the infrastructure is completed, we get financial assurance from the developer that that infrastructure will last at least 2 years. And so we require what's called a 2-year maintenance bond, and it covers any defects or workmanship issues that would normally crop up within a 2-year time frame, and it makes sure that those utilities and that infrastructure is repaired or replaced as needed. And so after that, it becomes the city's responsibility to maintain and operate that infrastructure. And so what we're looking to improve and what we'd like to see changed is the process that we use beforehand to make sure that it does get built, because there are times where a plat may be approved, but the infrastructure is not built in a timely manner. And so we want to have a process that ensures that infrastructure gets completed when it needs to be completed. So I think that's pretty much all we have for our presentation tonight. What we were hoping to get is some feedback about what you guys would like to see, or any issues that you may have experienced or heard of other people experience, so that we could look at that and see how any options or any improvements we could make could address those issues.
Wesley, I was going to ask, just as we're going through the process, you know, we've talked a lot tonight when we're talking about development, thinking about developers, and you know, laying out new streets, utility infrastructure putting in, which certainly is part of this and deserves to be designed right. It's also true that a fair amount of downtown Bastrop is just single-family residential lots already. It's getting older, it's getting kind of ripe for redevelopment. Are the same standards to apply, and how do we make sure that we're not prohibiting the little guy from necessarily redeveloping his property that doesn't necessarily have access to the resources that, you know, a large developer developing 50, 100 lots might have? You know, it just feels like if we put a big roadblock in the way, we're going to end up with a lot of urban decay and just properties that aren't redeveloped because it's too much of a hassle or too much of a problem to deal with standards that are really written for kind of multi-million-dollar developments.
Yeah. Or brand new subdivision. That's another piece to our subdivision ordinance that just is not covered very well. Our subdivision ordinance is definitely set up to apply to larger developments that are building new infrastructure and not necessarily improving old infrastructure or determining whether or not that old infrastructure needs to be improved. And that kind of goes back to Melissa's comment that we're trying to establish, as you'd call it, some thresholds that help, one, define based on where the property is in terms of the area that relies on the infrastructure in front of the property, where it is, what kind of capacity it has, what kind of condition it's in, to see if there are ways to promote and encourage development while at the same time ensuring that we have the infrastructure to support that development. And so that's another key part of what these regulations want to address, is the different variations of the types of developments that we see. You know, differentiating between a new large development and then from redevelopment areas within the city. Well,
one thing I would like to see is consideration given to mainly the northern part of our city, but the northern part of our city has a lot of irregularly shaped lots, lots that could never be developed under our current code because they're too small, and unless this person sells and this person sells, and we combine a bunch of these smaller lots into one, legal sized lot, it'll never be developed. So I would like to see some consideration given to those types of lots, and either a process where we can go through and approve something more easily, or that we can just say, hey, if it's a small, irregularly shaped lot, we'll work with you to get that developed. Otherwise, it's just going to sit there forever until the county takes it back because nobody's paying the taxes, and somebody's going to have to just wait until they can get enough lots together and then replat them into one and go from there. But it just creates a really long process and leaves a lot of vacant land that could be developed in the future.
That is a great example of what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to incorporate, I'd say, not necessarily flexibility, but the ability to encourage innovative development. Our ordinance now is fairly rigid, and so we see it all the time where we work with people that either have an irregularly shaped lot that doesn't have great access, or we see someone that wants to develop the property in a way that really does make sense, and it would fit a need that the city has, and it could be done in a way that's sustainable, that meets all of the benefits that we're looking for in these regulations. But because our ordinance does not give us that flexibility to work within certain boundaries, we really want to add those options.
Both good comments. Anyone else?
I just want to make a comment about the design issues that you've brought up. I've only been in Bastrop a short time, but the items that you talk about, promoting the feel of Bastrop, talking about environmental sustainability, I think those are great objectives to be going after. And then you talk about the tree preservation, street lights, street width, street designs. We've got all the right items on the table to start talking about. Now it's just collecting them and moving them forward.
So, I mean, we want to create a city that people want to live in, and there's a lot that goes into living in a city. Melissa hit the nail on the head where people don't want to just have to go sit in their house. I mean, they want to be able to branch out and not have to drive everywhere, and they want to have things to do, and they want the city to look nice. And that's kind of what we're after. We're after a system and a process that does not create an unreasonable delay or an unreasonable burden on developers and subdividers, that take all different forms. We want to create a city that's sustainable, that looks good, and is functional.
And if it's easy to get around in and we can walk it, maybe we'll get to know our neighbors again.
That's right.
Which would be a really cool thing.
I have a quick question. Are there any type of family subdivisions in Bastrop that have like different regulations? I know cities sometimes have that if you're dividing it for a family member. Okay.
No, I think Bastrop County does, but we don't have. So the city operates, or most cities operate under a different chapter of the local government code than counties do. The cities operate under Chapter 212 of the local government code, and counties operate under Chapter 232. I think it's 232. It's a different chapter. Yeah, and one of those 230-somethings. But they have different standards, and they're fairly similar, but there's nuances that are different.
Well, if there's no more questions, I want to thank the staff. It's obvious that there's a lot of work that's gone into this, and I think the proposal on the subdivision ordinances and the changing and the recommendations that I see here, I think are very encouraging. And
thank you. Thank you very much for your feedback.
Thank you. Appreciate you. All right. We will move on now to our items for individual. I'm sorry, I need to close out the workshop first. Appreciate that. And we will move on to item 4, the items for individual consideration. First item is A, consider to approve meeting minutes from the August 31, 2017 and October 19, 2017 Planning and Zoning Commission meetings. You all had a chance to read them? Do I have a motion?
Motion to approve both, as is.
Motion by Mr. Connell and second by Mr. Lassen. Diddy, would you call the roll, please?
Debbie Moore,
Yes.
Patrick Connell,
Yes.
Alyssa Halley Schramm,
Abstain.
Diana Rose,
Yes.
Cynthia Meyer,
Yes.
Sue Ann Fruget,
Abstain.
Richard Gartman,
Abstain.
Matt Lassen.
Yes.
Both the motions pass. Item B, public hearing and consider action to recommend approval of an ordinance, has been pulled by the applicant.
Yes, the applicants pulled it to reconsider their rezoning request, and they'll come back in at the November meeting.
Thank you. We move on to item C, consider action to recommend approval of a preliminary plat for 90.93 acres of the Bastrop Town Tract, Abstract 11, to be known as Piney Creek Bend subdivision, located to the west of Carter Street between Riverwood Drive and Reed's Bend in the Bastrop city limits, and forward to the next city council meeting. Ms. Jennifer.
Yes, so this is the Piney Creek Bend subdivision. Just to remind where we are in the process on this project, because I've only been here for 7 months, but I hear this has been talked about for a while. So previously, the zoning was established for this development through a planned development. So that zoning was established, I think, in 2015, and then now we're at the step of the preliminary plat. After that comes the construction plans that give the final lot layout and the detail for the infrastructure improvements. And then after that will be the final plat that will go back to, at this point, City Council. The location of this development is west of Carter Street and between Carter Street and Piney Creek Bend. It's this blue area on the map.
I don't want to interrupt you, but where did this come from? We're curious.
We'll get to that.
Is that a staff thing or somebody?
No, that's from a member of the public.
Got it. Okay.
Vivi was just getting it out there, so ready to go. So the plat you have in your packet is on 2 pages, so it's hard to see the whole extent of the property, but it is 90.93 acres, and it's 170 single-family lots with an open space lot along the front, and then a large parkland and open space / conservation area. There's its current use is it's undeveloped. There's been no development on this site. It was established in the Piney Creek Bend Plan development that established the lot standards and some other requirements in that document that will be carried out through the preliminary construction and final plat process. The land use, future land use for this area is neighborhood residential, which this plat complies with. And the open space and parkland area along Piney Creek Bend is 52.8 acres on the plat.
So there's more open space and parkland than will have houses on it?
Yes. Out of the 90.93 acres. And this is kind of, goes into the drainage discussion on making sure that the areas along creeks and watersheds is protected. Established in the plan development zoning, there were 2 different residential lot standards that were adopted. There was the Urban 5 and the Urban and Suburban 6 was what they were called in the planning document. It's 170 units total. 67 are the Urban 5, which are roughly 50 by 110 feet in size and 6,000 square feet. And then the 103 are 60 by 120 and are a minimum of 7,200 square feet. By comparison, our standard single-family 7 zoning district, which is our smallest single-family zoning allowed, is standards require 60 feet by 120 and 7,000 square feet. So these lots are right in that same range. And then I'll let Wesley talk a little bit about the preliminary utility plans.
So the subdivision is going to have underground utilities. It's going to have water, sewer, drainage, and electric systems that are all served by the city of Bastrop. This is in Bastrop Power and Light's service territory, and it's in our water and sewer service territory. And so this chart, I apologize, it's a little hard to see, but the green lines sort of represent the overall layout of the wastewater system. The way it's designed currently is to collect all of those wastewater flows and route them to a wastewater lift station. Sometimes when systems that require gravity to help them flow correctly get to a point where they're too low to match up to the existing system. And so the way to overcome that is to have what's called a lift station, which is essentially a large manhole that contains a pump system that can put that wastewater under pressure and pump it up to our existing system. And so that's how this is designed. The wastewater will flow down to the lift station that's currently shown kind of on the bottom right-hand side of the neighborhood, and it will then be pumped through a pressurized system up to the existing wastewater lines that we have near Carter Street. So the water lines will be expanded and improved to connect throughout the neighborhood and create what we call a loop system. And that loop system is important because it provides multiple routes for water to take to get to a point. which is important if the city is having to repair or if there's a malfunction in one part of the line. Many times you can isolate that area but still not interrupt service to other residents. And so this system would be designed to create a loop system that could provide that functionality. On the drainage system, this is something that we've looked at very closely, and we are considering all of the potential impacts that could be caused by a development like this. What we typically look at is not only where the property is in relation to the major waterways that serve and receive drainage or runoff from that property, but also how it interrelates to surrounding neighborhoods and other properties. And so it's not unique, but it's sort of uncommon to see properties when they're developed near a major waterway such as Piney Creek that has a 38 square mile watershed. And given where this property is located in relation to the boundaries of that watershed, there's sometimes cases where you don't follow standards that you would normally follow in other areas that are developed. And a lot of times that comes down to the requirement to provide stormwater detention. So in areas where you are adjacent to a major waterway and the relationship between your development and the overall watershed is such that you make up not only a small portion of it, but if you're located closer to the downstream area of the watershed, it actually makes more sense to allow that water to develop, get in the system, and get out of the system before the major flood water that occurs in other areas of the watershed has time to get through the system. Because a typical stormwater detention area, or detention pond, is designed to hold water back and release it at a slower rate. And so if you can imagine, if you hold that water back and release it at a slower rate, you can actually have a greater risk of discharging that water while that major flood water is coming through the watershed. A good example would be in the Halloween flood of 2015. When we had, it was roughly 8 inches of rain that came through the city, but that water, that rain had developed and that water had gotten out of the system before the rain that fell in North Austin and in Onion Creek was able to make it down through the city. If you can remember, back then it was, a bright, sunshiny day out here, but the river was actually higher than it got on Memorial Day of that year, of 2015. So that kind of shows you that if it had happened the opposite, where the rain was falling while that flood water was coming through, we would have seen a lot more damage, because that water is competing or conflicting with that flood water that's coming through the system. Does that make sense to everybody? I know it's somewhat counterintuitive to think of why you wouldn't want to have stormwater detention in every case, but there are cases where it does not make sense, and it actually could create a greater risk of impact downstream if you do provide it. So besides that, we don't just stop there and say, well, they just don't have to do this. We take it a step further and look at the other issues that go along with drainage systems and the way they operate outside of just a peak flow standpoint. You're dealing with water, but you're also dealing with water that's flowing. Sometimes it can be flowing at a fast rate, and when it flows at that faster rate, you tend to see that water develop what we call an erosive velocity, where you see more areas tend to succumb to scour and erode away. And so there are ways to mitigate that. And so that's going to be the focus on this development, to make sure that the system's designed in a way to not just discharge water directly into the creek. We're going to require that the system be designed to not necessarily detain and hold back the water, for a long period of time, but to slow it down and have it work through the system at a slower rate so that that water has time to kind of allow any sediment to settle out in areas that are designated and designed to handle that sediment, and also kind of allow that water to slow down so that it's not leaving the site at a high velocity so that you could tend to see erosion problems. And so it's a little, these orange lines are where I've outlined kind of the major improvements that are being proposed as part of the drainage system. And one piece to this that really helps that is along these, along the kind of the outer boundary of the neighborhood, you can see where the lines end, and you can see that they end at points all along the boundary. There's what is that? 2, 4, 5 different discharge points that are all designed to collect and drain that water in a way that doesn't just collect it all and discharge it into one point into the creek. It's distributing the flows out so that it can then be handled through some other type of structure that helps slow that water down and kind of do more to mimic that natural condition.
So is it fair to say we're not trying to slow the water down, we're just trying to retard it a little bit so that we don't have damage from the flow?
That's right. A standard detention pond, you typically design those to hold that water and discharge it over roughly a 24-hour period. And so this would be designed to drain that water in less time than that, but in a way that allows the water to kind of dissipate some of its energy so that it's not creating any kind of erosion potential within the neighborhood or downstream of the neighborhood.
Leslie, I have a question about the lift station, and I'm not that familiar with them, but is there any concern, since that's kind of a low-lying side of the site toward the river, that if it were to ever flood, what happens to a lift station if it were to flood?
That's a great question. So the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, that is the governing authority on how lift stations are designed and what our regulations defer to in most cases, they have special requirements for lift stations that are built in low-lying areas. And they have to be built to higher standards, and they have to be built so that they can continue to operate in flood conditions. And they have to be built to where you can access it during a flood condition.
So this lift station would have to meet all those standards?
Yes, if it's, depending on where it is, I would say yes. Yes. I think that's, Jennifer, you want to talk about, or I can talk about it. So Jennifer showed the chart that we had before that kind of showed where we are in the process and where we're not in the process. So where we're not in the process is the point where we've gotten the level of detail that would need to be provided before any construction happens on the property. And so the next step after the preliminary plat goes through its process is for the developer to submit those detailed construction plans that really clarify and define how all of the infrastructure is going to work, how it's going to be built, how it's going to be maintained, and how any other necessary requirements to build that development. Past that, the final plat will be submitted and work through the process, and the final plat is what creates the legal definition of all of the lot boundaries. It's what legally breaks up the property into its component parts and allows the developer to sell property to builders.
Wesley, at what process start then on this plan?
Well, everything is ministerial through approving the final plat and getting the final plat approved, okay, or recorded. So the preliminary plat and the process that applies to those is ministerial, and the process that we go through for the final plat is also ministerial. Does ever.
Yeah, I was just going to clarify. The local government code literally says plat. It does not break down into the different types of plats. The preliminary and final steps that are established by our own code. So all plats are considered ministerial, like Wesley said. So. Remember my last slide? Questions? That was the last slide. And I was just also going to clarify, we did send out property notifications to surrounding owners. I think we sent 41 of those. And what you got on the dice just now from Vivi was something we received earlier this afternoon from a citizen. So, any other questions? Remember to use your mic.
Turn your mic on.
I'm sorry, nothing from the 41?
We didn't get any written comments, no. Okay. But we have, I believe, people signed up to speak.
So let me make sure we all understand what is coming before us tonight. The zoning changes have been approved. It's been approved to build 170 homes. What we're here tonight to discuss are the preliminary plats. And while we want to hear from everybody who wants to speak, we're not here to debate whether the subdivision should be built or not. We're only here to discuss and make a recommendation on the preliminary plats. So having said that, I hope you'll all keep that in mind. We have a number of participants that want to speak. We would ask that you keep your comments to 3 minutes or less and speak to the topic at hand, please. First card I have is from Marie Blazik. Please give us your name and your address, please, ma'am.
My name's Marie Blasek, and I live at 400 Oak Street, and I live actually on the corner of Oak and Carter, right there in the big middle of it. And there wasn't a comments section on the letters that we received. They didn't have a solicitation for comments. The 41 people that received letters, mine didn't ask for my comments, but here I am. Okay, so I have one major question, and I don't know if you're going to even answer questions, but the 52 acres of parkland, who will be responsible for that? I know that it'll be transferred to the city. That is a huge amount of parkland. It's wonderful, of course, but right now it's mesquite and ragweed, which is why I can't talk. Anyway, so that is anyway, I won't repeat myself because I don't have too much time. Someone will have to decide what happens with that, okay? And the flip side of that is most people have no idea how powerful Piney Creek is. And it will really, I mean, when either the Colorado backs up or we have the watersheds there's intense rain, it is a force to be dealt with. So that's a huge responsibility. Those 52 acres in that creek are, and I'm telling you this because I want you to help take care of it because it's also a huge resource. The other thing, I hope I have time to say this, but Carter Street's really a wonderful street. We have a lot of bicyclers, and it hooks up with River, Reed's Bend, and it's really a rather wonderful part of town. And I certainly hope that we do have decent sidewalks and that the pedestrian traffic continues and that the kids walking down the street with their fishing poles are still going down to the low water crossing. But the other thing is, I do not want to look at the backside of 26 ugly fences. And so, because Carter Street, the development, you will go into the development, okay, and the streets, the houses will be facing inward, and then the backside is Carter Street. And I don't know what the plans are for that. I know what
These are just preliminary.
Yes.
We haven't gotten to that kind of detail.
Okay, well, I just want to put this in your mind because with Singleton, when the city council voted for this, he made it look really beautiful. La, 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 it was Disneyland. And it really can be, but we need protection because one of the stipulations, one of the parts of the code is that it has to, that this development should in some ways reflect the character of the town. And if you just have 4 blocks of ugly wooden fences, which is what could happen, it won't be, it'll be awful. And I'll have to look at it, so.
We hope it'll be beautiful.
Yes, well, I hope so. So anyway, parks, really important. City's going to own those parks.
That's your 3 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for what you do. And thank you, Jennifer, for all that you do. All right.
Thank you, Ms. Blazek.
Is there, for parkland, are there requirements for that? So her question was, it's just
She's going to maintain.
just Mesquite, and it's nothing fancy right now. Is there a requirement to make it parkland for us to take over?
Well, part of it is, there's requirement in their plan development was for 25 acres of parkland, but again, some of our concern is making sure we can conserve that riverbank. So that's what we're looking at, is the part that'll be the active park versus the part that might be more of a passive, maintained area for drainage and not disrupting Piney Creek.
But is that like they would have to plant sod or something, make it pretty, not just here's 25 acres of land for you to do whatever with? Is there requirements for that?
I don't believe there's any requirements for them to develop the park land. It's just to give it to the city and it'll be ours to develop.
Okay.
And another item to bring up, they in the PD they did have a requirement to create a trail system that would connect Carter Street back to the parkland, and then that all lots the back to parkland be decorative fencing. And if you look at notice your plat might, if you looked at it online, the parkland actually wraps around through to the front of Carter Street. So all those lots should be installing decorative fence according to their zoning.
I did just want to add, just to be clear on the 52 acres of parkland, I don't want to create an expectation that that's going to be a fully developed city park. We haven't gotten to that level of detail yet and defined how that land would be used and how it would be restricted and how it would be developed.
Given to the city, or it's still maintained by the developer, but we can do whatever we want with it?
Well, the way it's set up now is that it is intended to be dedicated to the city. But again,
dedicated or deeded? Like, does the city own it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it would become city-owned parkland. But again, I want to just be very clear that when we say parkland, we're not necessarily saying a 52-acre city park. It could end up being a very it could be developed as more or left as more of a conservation area, so that the drainage capacity and the floodplain areas along Piney Creek can be managed and better controlled.
Robert Silbernagel.
Hello, I'm Margaret Silbernagel. I live at 400B Magnolia, so I am right at the corner. I do want to comment that I am impressed with the improvement on this preliminary plat from what we were seeing with the with the conceptual layout. There is more access to the parkland at the corner of Reed's Bend and Carter Street. I was glad to see that. I was hoping to hear from the developer himself to see his input on this. One of the questions I have, and I'm really excited to hear about the drainage plan. That's really great, and the improvements to the subdivision ordinance. The question I have at this point is, we're looking at approving the preliminary plat right now. When and if we do make the subdivision changes, so we're approving this plat with the subdivision ordinance as it is. When we get to the final plat, will we be locked into the current subdivision ordinance, or will like if this doesn't get to the final plat until after those subdivision ordinance updates, how will that apply? And that's my question. Thank you very much.
So that's a great question, and the answer is it depends. There are certain timelines that apply to the approval of a preliminary plat. I believe, is it a year? I'm trying to think. So after a preliminary plat is approved, it does have a shelf life. If no construction is started, or if we don't reach a certain point and progress in the process according to the ordinance, then the preliminary plat would expire and they would be required to resubmit. And as Ms. Margaret said, if that all happens and the subdivision regulations have been updated, then yes, it would have to comply with the new regulations. But that's why it depends. It goes back to the developer to define and work towards that progress.
That's only if their preliminary expires.
That's right. But even if, we talked about this a little bit before, but this is a little confusing about our process, but there is a difference between a final plat being approved by City Council and it actually being recorded at the county clerk's office. Once the plat is recorded at the county clerk's office, then it's pretty much set forever. But if a certain amount of progress isn't made between the time that City Council approves the plat and the infrastructure gets built, there's also some time limits in there. It's under what we call our dormant subdivision plat ordinance, and it's intended to make sure that after the final plat's approved, that construction actually happens within a reasonable amount of time. And so if that doesn't happen, that's another milestone or another expiration date that could occur that would then require the developer to resubmit and go through the process again.
In your experience, how often does that happen with something this size?
It happens.
Okay.
It happens. It's uncommon, but it happens.
Wesley, let me just get clear. I'm trying to get this timeline in my head. We're talking about the preliminary plat right now.
Yes, ma'am.
So we're waiting approval for that. And we're talking about new subdivision regulations possibly the end of February?
Yes.
So how much time can go by before this preliminary plat is approved?
I believe it's 30 days, right?
What's the question exactly, I guess? Before the preliminary plat is to be approved?
Correct.
Before it expires?
Well,
before it's approved.
Before it's
30
approved.
days. So we
Okay.
have to, the rules are what the rules are right now, and we have to continue to consider the current preliminary plat under those rules. And
Okay.
so it has to continue on that 30-day time
30
frame.
days, okay. That's what I need to know. Thank you.
Pam Veer.
Thank you, Pam Veer, 402 Oak Street. That was a question that I had. You kept talking about expiration dates of preliminary plats. At the beginning of this meeting, you talked about new standards for your procedure, and I am wondering if we had that in place back a year ago before it was voted on to do this. I know I'm going backwards, that this may not have ever been approved in the first place, but it has been approved, so we're moving forward. You mentioned that map updates from 2006 information earlier, that those will be updated before this preliminary plat is...
It's two different animals.
Two different animals?
Yes, because the preliminary plat has to do with this subdivision right here.
Okay.
The maps that Wesley was referencing before had to do with 100-year floods and what the floodplains were and the like.
Okay, so before you approve some preliminary plat, will those be looked at again?
Yes.
Okay, all right, got that down. Second, I'm a little discouraged about the condition of the property over the past year since it's been sold from the past owner. It has not been taken care of. It's in horrible disrepair. Trees are overgrown. I'm a little concerned about the owner and whoever he hires to develop this. Will they really care about the citizens of Bastrop and what we need or want?
Well, they're going to have to bring the property up to standards before they can they can build on it.
And you will make sure that happens before the preliminary
We
plat
will,
is
and so will
approved?
our planning department and the city council.
Okay. The citizens that frequent or live in that area are very aware that when it rains, I'm talking medium, not high rains, that those lots are full of water for quite a while after a rain. Please take that into consideration before approving the plat, please. Who will be responsible for building perhaps a new bridge over the Colorado River to help perhaps 300-plus vehicles moving from that subdivision through town to access the old Bridge 71? Will the developers help? A bridge needs to be built.
That's not, the building a bridge is not conditional with approval of their plat or building a subdivision.
So how?
But I'm with you, I hope we get a bridge, I don't know who's going to pay for it.
So will the city work on the infrastructure before this is built in order to help access people out to 71? Is that being taken into consideration at all?
I can talk about that.
That's my 3 minutes.
Patrick's going to speak to your question.
I can tell you that the city's transportation plan has a bridge going over, another bridge going over the Colorado at some point. When that point is to be determined. But if you go and you look at the transportation plan for the city, that's one of the things that we considered last year when it was put into place. So it's there, along with a number of other increases to connectivity throughout the city. So that's there, but I don't believe there's a mechanism to force the developer to do anything like that to support that traffic and whatnot, as long as the current roads and the traffic study supports what's going in.
So the 300-plus vehicles that will come from this subdivision that is being built is going to, you know where it's going to go, right? You know where those vehicles are going to go.
Right.
And you know what Alley A looks like. I'm just, you know. And then I'm sorry, I'm out of time, but you talked about a 2-year infrastructure, the infrastructure that will be built, that you have a 2-year guarantee on that before the city has to take over responsibility?
So,
it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, it's called a retribution period, when you have 2 years in which you need to bring up deficiencies that you see. With this, I think go ahead, Wesley, if you want to come up. Help me on this one.
So think
I know what I want to say, but I can't get it out.
So think of that 2-year maintenance period as sort of a warranty period. You know, when you
That's
buy
a warranty period.
project, when you buy a product, it normally comes with a warranty. This is no different. It's a financial mechanism, a financial document that's provided to the city that ensures that any defects in the construction or any workmanship problems that are identified within that period are corrected. And so it covers things. Every once in a while you'll see a soft spot in the pavement develop. Well, that document ensures that if the developer does not come to fix it, we can access the money that's provided with that bond to fix it.
Barbara Coy. Hi.
I'm Barbara Coy, and I live at 405 Linden Street. And to begin with, I never received a letter. I lived there since 1977. And my question is concerning the Piney Creek impact study. Has that been completed? Because like 2 other people have said, when it rains, it floods. That 90 acres, most of it is in standing water. The bridge is closed. All the traffic's coming down Carter Street, you know, that lives back in the Blue Bonnet, or that subdivision back there, yeah. And the problem with that is anything going to be done with Carter Street? Is that going to be repaired, widened, fixed, whatever, before even the construction starts? And I'm rather confused here. Has this property been sold, and is this a new developer?
I don't know if it has or not. The subdivision has been approved,
Yeah.
and whoever develops it has the approval to go ahead and develop it.
Well, no, my question is-
Subject to our regulations.
I know that. My question is I thought all of this had been approved back in December.
The zoning was approved. They did not begin to develop the property. They didn't submit a plat, any kind of documents to start the construction process. They have now. That's
Okay.
what we're talking about.
Well, I was
tonight.
just wondering because there was, right after everything was approved, there was a big for sale sign right on the property. So,
Surprised me too.
but anyway, you know, my concern is the flooding and Carter Street.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Jeff Partita?
Good evening, Council. Thanks for taking my comments. My name is Jeff Partita, and I live right at the intersection of Carter Street and Laurel. If we could go back to the slide that has the outline of the roads in blue. Can I change it here? Oh, sorry. My concern is, much like many of the others, has to do with flooding and with traffic. But in a lot of these meetings, we get the high-level visual. You don't get a lot of the details. So a couple of the details that at least I feel are more important, and I'm not sure if it's something from the developer side or from the council side, is that with the flooding, the Riverwood Road, which is directly south, it's the blue line that's at the bottom, that road gets shut down. And what happens is people that normally take that road to go home, they have to take Carter Street, which is on the right side, all the way around to Reed's Bend. So there's going to be extra traffic going through there when it does flood because that road does get shut down. The other thing has to do with traffic. So the traffic study that was previously done was done the week of Thanksgiving, in which there's no buses going, all schools were out, people were probably out of town. So I'm going to give whoever did it the benefit of the doubt that that was just the week that was picked unintentionally. So it might be a good idea to revisit or redo that traffic study to get a better indication of what happens day to day, because none of the buses that travel daily were taken into account. So thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to make any comments? If not, I'll close the public hearing. Commission, do you have any other questions, comments?
I do have a question regarding the Piney Creek watershed study that's being done. Would it be wise to have that study finished before we even consider preliminary plat approval?
I don't think we can wait.
Well, the good news is that study's not complete. However, it is far enough along that the engineers that have worked on this have been able to incorporate those, the findings that have come from where our consultants are in the study. And so they have incorporated the findings of that study into their flood studies. There's been two different efforts that have kind of paralleled each other, and the engineers that have worked on this have been coordinating with the engineers that are working for us, providing that study. And so the work that's being done with this is incorporating those.
Wesley, I have a question about the traffic impact analysis. So in our report here, it says it was submitted in 2015 as part of the plan development process. And then there's a statement, I guess I'm just not understanding, because it says per the subdivision ordinance, a TIA must be updated if more than 12 months passes before the development is initiated. But then it says, continues on saying, no major developments have occurred in the area since the TIA was prepared, so an updated one is not necessary. I'm just wondering, I'm confused by the 12-month period in the 2015 date.
And that 12-month period is language in our subdivision ordinance, and it's there, for good reason. If a study and if a lot of work's been done on a development at one time, but then enough time passes, there are many cases where that would need to be updated, refreshed with the data that shows what's changed between when it was originally done and when the new development is occurring. And we went through that process, and we talked about requiring the requirement to update the TIA, but the original TIA that was submitted anticipated 190 lots. And so today the proposal is for 170 lots. And so when we went back and really looked at what would need to be updated, it really did not make sense to update the TIA from the one that was submitted right at 2 years ago. Because one, the number of lots that are proposed today is 20 lots less, and there hasn't been anything more than you know, just probably a few houses that have been built in that area. I say a few, I don't know the number, but there's been minor developments within the area, and so the amount of impact and the change between what a new study would show, I would certainly anticipate to actually show less of an impact than what the original study said.
Thank you for clarifying.
Go ahead. I would just say, as long as you're on traffic impact analysis, is there anything to the data being over Thanksgiving, and just
I would need to
if that's a credible study to begin with, and what the city's staff perspective is on that?
Well, there's two answers to that. One is I need to go back and look at the exact date. I don't know that it was the week of Thanksgiving. It could have been. I will say that we did go take our own measurements, because I remember that being a concern during the rezoning process, and we found that the counts were very similar.
Just to clarify, the preliminary plat as submitted meets all our requirements, correct? Yes, okay. So this is mostly for everybody that's here. I'm glad that everybody's here. It's great, good comments. These would be great things to come and visit to our next meeting or the city council meeting, where we start looking at redoing our subdivision ordinance. These are the concerns that you have are things that we could address during a rewrite of the subdivision ordinance, because then they would be required to do the preliminary plat. We don't, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have the authority to reject this preliminary plat because of flooding concerns or, you know, studies that aren't done yet, or the infrastructure the way it is. That's not a part of the subdivision and platting process currently, correct?
Yes.
So all these comments you guys have would be great to come back and bring to us and bring to the council when we start looking at rewriting the subdivision, so that in the future we're able to go to that and say, look, you know, you need to do this, this, and this, because it's part of the ordinance.
I forgot to mention earlier that we do have representatives for the developer. This is Gary Jones. He's the project engineer for the neighborhood. And I think, did you want to say something?
I just to address the TIA comment. The original traffic study was signed and sealed in October of 2015, so it couldn't have been done over Thanksgiving. But I'd be glad to answer any questions that you have. Like I said, I was involved with the zoning, so Wesley and I had the privilege of going through that process together. So I'm familiar with you know, what was done before, and we're working on the engineering to make this development something that everybody is proud of.
Thank you.
Are there any dates on the TIA that reference November that could be confusing?
The traffic counts had to be done before he signed and sealed the report. So.
Okay, so if it was done in October, there's no way it was done in over than November. Okay.
The city. Well.
Okay.
What he's saying is that the TIA was submitted in October.
Now, during the...
Hold on, please.
During the zoning process, because there was so much...
Can you get closer to the mic, please?
Yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah, raise it up.
Raise it up, there you go.
So during the zoning process, because there was so much concern for the traffic, and by the way, the TIA wasn't required during the zoning process. We did that to address the citizens' concerns. And there was so much concern about the TIA, the city actually initiated their own traffic studies. So if there was a study done after October, it was done by somebody else.
Could that have been ours?
I think I can clear that up. I think that's actually when we went and took our counts.
Okay, so
we went out because there was a concern that the counts were not, there was a citizen concern that the counts weren't accurate. And so we went out and placed our traffic counters out, and it could have been the week of Thanksgiving.
Okay, so the TIA for the developer was done in October, not during the holiday, and ours could have been done over the Thanksgiving
that's correct.
holiday. Okay, and they showed similar readings?
No, they were less than what the original TIA said.
Okay. Does that clear up everybody's confusion a little bit?
Let me just ask, I'm sorry. Since the TIA is such a conflicting issue right now, wouldn't it be wise to do a new one to see what it is today in 2017? I understand there hadn't been development, but it seems like there's a lot of questions, and I think just for clarity, getting a new one done wouldn't hurt.
We're recommending, because of the lack of development that would have created an impact, and the fact that the TIA that was originally submitted assumed a larger number or a higher lot count than what's being proposed today. In my opinion, there would not be a benefit to that.
Be an expense to another expense to the developer. And I understand the concern, but we're here right, the traffic counts were taken into consideration when council approved the rezoning. What we're here today is talk about is, and all of this concern was taken into consideration by the council. What we have before us today is consideration of the preliminary plat, not to revisit those things that the council's already ruled on.
I have a motion to approve the plat as is, as submitted.
Motion to approve by Mr. Patrick. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Richard. Vivi, would you call the roll, please?
Absolutely. Debbie Moore?
Yes.
Patrick Connell?
Yes.
Alyssa Halley Schramm?
Yes.
Diana Rose? Yes. Cynthia Meyer?
No.
Sue Ann Fruget?
Yes.
Richard Gartman?
Yes.
Matt Lassen?
Yes.
Motion passes with one dissenting vote. Thank you.
And this still go to City Council.
Thank you, everyone, and it'll go to City Council
on the 14th.
On the 14th, if you wish to come then. We'll move on to item 4D. Public hearing and consider action to recommend approval of replat of Bastrop Chapel Subdivision Lot 2 into 2 residential lots located at 2300 Pecan Street in the Bastrop city limits and forward to the next City Council meeting. I'll open the public hearing.
So this would be one of those specific instances in local government code that I was speaking about earlier. Anytime you're doing a replat and creating more lots in a residential subdivision, it's required to come back before the Planning Commission as a public hearing. So in this case, this was a 2-lot subdivision. You can see the house on the left, and then the lot in question on the right, in the outline in blue. So there was 2 lots, 2 very large lots, and the request is to subdivide this lot 2 into 2 lots. The existing lot 2 is 17,772 square feet.
Wow.
It was recorded in 2010. Currently, there is a single-family house that's under construction facing Pecan, so it's actually front-loaded onto Pecan with the driveway off of Magnolia. The existing zoning in this area is single-family 7, which requires lots to be a minimum of 7,000 square feet. And the future land use for this area is neighborhood residential. So for the 2 lots that they're requesting, lot 2A to the west would be 7,797 square feet, and the lot to the east, which is where the existing house is being constructed, would be just shy of 10,000 square feet still. And it meets the single-family 7 zoning standards. Here's the example of what the plat will look like after it's subdivided into 2 lots. It establishes all the setbacks and the public utility easements that are necessary for both. and the existing house that's under construction. Here's the draft plan of it. Shows that the house is 23 feet from Magnolia, and then roughly, I think about 19 feet from what'll be the rear property line. And the setback there is required to be 15 feet.
Jennifer, I'm going to ask just because you and I talked about it. So when we got the packet for tonight, I asked Jennifer to request the form survey from the builder so that we can confirm where the house is at. And my understanding tonight was that a form survey was never done.
No, and the applicant is here to talk. I think did you get that done this week, or?
It's done, but it didn't get.
Yeah. So Dave McKenzie is the developer of these two lots, and he can
real quick. This drawing we have here, where is this from, or who?
This was what was submitted with the building permit application.
Okay, and I know we've had a field inspection already, but does that include like measurements? Is he out there with measuring to confirm these distances?
Our inspector, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, when they asked for a form survey on.
Tell us who you are, sir.
David McKenzie.
Okay.
When they asked for a form survey just a few days ago, we called the surveyor and they came out and said everything was fine, but they couldn't get all the drawing. They came out and measured or set all the corners and did, took all the preliminaries to do it, but apparently it didn't happen today. They told me yesterday it would happen today, but they didn't get it back to me before closing. But they said everything was fine.
And we can get that to forward that to the council for a final approval.
Do we just have a rough measurement of what would I guess be the back of the house by the carport to what the nearest lot line would be, dividing the two lot 2A and 2B?
It's less than 50, it's over 15.
It's okay. Sorry, yeah, we're on camera now.
Yes, it is 15-foot setback. I mean, that's from the carport to the back property line, which, well, I can't tell off that, but it is 15, and I instructed the surveyor, if it wasn't, to move the new plat line so it would be. And it was within an inch or two, and we didn't know exactly but it will meet that setback.
But supposedly it's at 15 feet, which is the exact requirement for so if it's different, you have to amend this plat.
Yes.
And just to clarify.
By an inch or something.
And we can have that information for council, so we can do, dependent upon the results of that form survey.
Just to clarify, because I think I asked about this, so in our previous packet we had the SF7 is 60 by 120. Is it 60 by 120 or 60 by 110 for the minimum?
110.
I thought it was 110, but this says 120. I'm just getting clarification because
I think I got overzealous on writing. It is 110. So
are we sure? And
yes,
the only reason I'm asking is that these are 112. So if it's
it's
120,
it's 110.
then
there were too many numbers, obviously, and I was throwing that together too quickly.
That's fine. I just wanted to.
So it is
clarify.
110, and so the lot is irregularly shaped, but when you average the depths and the widths, it comes out to meet our regulations.
And am I correct in seeing that lot 2A is 60 feet wide? It's kind of
69 feet wide.
Okay, never mind. Okay, so moving that lot line a foot or two is not going to be an issue. Okay.
And we actually do have a plat note that goes on there that says if something is not built correctly, it is up to the subdivider to correct the issue with an amending plat or replat.
So if you get the information back, or you don't get the final information back before council, will you pull it for this next council meeting? Will you go forward with it? I mean, these are some
I'm
of the
pretty
same
confident we're going to get the information, so.
So we could approve it contingent upon getting.
Contingent upon that information to make sure it meets the regulations.
All the regulations.
And if it doesn't, yeah, we can pull it because then it wouldn't be meeting the regulations.
If we approve this tonight and then it had to be changed, would we have to start the process over, come back here first, or we would just amend it between us and council?
We could amend it between us and council. Okay, so it would probably literally be a matter of moving the lot line over a foot.
Right, but we would not have to approve the new one before it went to council for approval?
No, because you're not changing the public hearing and all that requirement is because we're creating an additional lot.
Okay.
So we're not increasing it any more than we already publicized for.
Okay.
Do we have anyone signed up to speak? This is a public hearing. Commission members, do you have any other questions? Okay. So I'll close the public hearing. I'll take a motion.
Make a motion that we approve and forward to council. Contingent on the changes, not getting the information or the form survey and adjusting the lot lines if necessary.
Yes.
I'll second.
Thank you. Have a motion and a second. Debbie, would you call the roll, please?
Absolutely. Debbie Moore?
Yes.
Patrick Connell?
Yes.
Alyssa Halley Schramm?
Yes.
Diana Rose? Yes. Cynthia Meyer?
Yes.
Sue Ann Fruget? Richard Gartman?
Yes.
Matt Lassen?
And it is approved.
And this
Contingent.
Yes, and this is one of those rare months where we actually have an extra week between P&Z and council because of the way the calendar falls.
Oh, that's right.
So we actually have more than a week before we have to start submitting our reports to council.
I have a quick question. Does plan development take a form survey during the approval process for the build, for the construction? Is that part of,
That's typically standard, yes. Somehow this fell through the cracks, and that's something we're working with our third-party reviewer.
Do we have like a site plan there, or at least something where the building was outlined on the?
That's what this was.
That's what that was. So
yeah.
that's what it was submitted initially. Okay.
So yeah, we've been working since we haven't had a building official with a third-party reviewer. So we're checking these things more frequently now.
Just making sure I understand the process.
Okay. Thank you all. And move on to item E, consider action to amend the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting dates for November and December due to holiday schedule.
So I just wanted to touch base and make sure, see where everyone is on the dates for the upcoming meetings. We do have a number of items that are on the schedule for the November 30th meeting. So I would prefer that we kept that meeting on the schedule, but we have time that if we need to move the December meeting, that we could publicize new submittal dates for that meeting.
What does the November 30th look like for everybody? Are we good? I'm seeing lots of nods.
Should I take a vote?
And then the December meeting, however, is December 28th, I believe, so would be our regular meeting. So there is the opportunity. Yeah. So we could move that up a week, would be one option.
Would it move that up to the 21st?
Or move it back a week into the first week of January and have it, well, and actually,
you have a special
looking
meeting.
at the schedule for the, for that, we could move that to the special meeting in January to talk, that when Director Gaddis is going to bring the new subdivision ordinance forward, so.
Do we have any idea what the agenda looks like for December?
Not yet, no.
So we don't have anything?
Not yet, but for CUPs and rezonings, the deadline for that is usually about the end of the month, first of the month, so we wouldn't know until the end of November if something was trying to get on that December meeting.
I will probably be out of town the last 2 weeks of December, but I'll be around in November.
So, but we could push the December 28th meeting to the January 4th special meeting.
That way we can catch
everything. And it'll keep us pretty much on our same schedule for submittal deadline.
How y'all look for that?
The
4th?
January 4th meeting is just what? Just the review of the subdivision stuff?
Right now it was for a special meeting for that, but we could post for other items on that if we have something that comes up.
So just cancel our December meeting then and move to the 4th?
Do we need to vote on that?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But it's something we need to post.
Okay.
And that's something I do want to kind of look at going forward, is establishing our calendar in January so that we can have the submittal. A lot of developers and surveyors rely on our calendar, so we want to make sure we're publicizing the right dates. So we'll probably be bringing forward in January a calendar for the whole year, looking forward to any of those kind of holidays and making sure we work out that calendar in advance.
Okay.
Because we
Cool.
all know when Christmas is.
leave November as it is, cancel December, and move it to January the 4th. All right. Section 5, Director of Planning and Development updates. Do we have any?
I'm going to let Vivi talk. She doesn't get to talk much.
All is well.
No, the boards and commissions appreciation banquet.
I was like, come on.
This is all your items.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we have our boards and commissions banquet coming up. Y'all should have gotten invitations in the mail. No. Who didn't?
I did, and it had confetti in it. It was exciting.
Okay.
I feel left out.
So, Debbie Moore. Okay, so we're gonna get you one for sure, because you've been on. So essentially, we're gonna be
invited. I did such a good job tonight. I'm not invited.
No, not true at all. No, and so it's going to be over at the convention center, and it's really exciting. Y'all do so much, as you know. Everything you do is volunteer. Every time y'all come up here and you sit for hours on end and you listen to things and you analyze it, and some of you drive around town before you actually even have to come and talk about it. I mean, that's an investment. That's your time, and we respect and appreciate that you take it seriously, because what y'all do affects our community. So we're setting aside this banquet so that we can honor you. It's going to be catered. There's going to be cheesecake there.
Yay.
Okay.
I'm going to crash the party whether I was invited or not.
And we welcome you, but really, I'm going to get you an invitation. We're going to give out certificates. We're going to give out plaques, and we're just going to have a good time. It's for you guys only, and we're just going to honor y'all and give y'all the credit and thanks and appreciation that honestly you deserve.
Thank you. I just skipped over. Thank you, Debbie. Do we have any direction from P&Z Commission on items to be included on future agendas? No. Item D, City Work Plan and Rosenberg's Rules of Order.
This is just notice, and I meant to bring copies, but the day got away from me. Two things to kind of look at on the city website. The staff and city council has been working on priorities for the upcoming 5 years. They have a 5-year plan. So if you all want to go online, or I can send you copies of our new city work plan that looks out for the next 5 fiscal years. And it's got a number of items, one being the subdivision ordinance update is one of them that's in our box of things to get done in the next fiscal year.
Where's the work plan?
Work plan, it's, I'll email it to you all, actually.
Okay,
it's
thanks.
Easier. It was presented to before council, I think, a month ago. And it's color-coded, it's very fancy, and it's got who's responsible for every item, and it's got 176 items? 187 items, even better. But that's for the next 5 years. However, a lot of them are for this upcoming year. So that's something we're all very excited to be working on. And then the other is that council adopted at their last meeting, or meeting before last, the Rosenberg's Rules of Order. And I'll send you all copies of that too. It's a much simpler version compared to Robert's Rules of Order on how to run a meeting. It's a lot easier to understand. It's not a 1,000-page book. It's a, I think, 15-page booklet that was developed by, I think, a judge or
Judge Rosenberg.
Judge
Rosenberg.
There you go, Judge Rosenberg in California, to have some easier to understand rules of order. So I'll send you all copies of that too, because that's the new style we're operating under.
Thank you, ma'am. Anybody have anything else?
I have a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Anybody that wants to stay can. We're going home. Thank you.